Why is your company and why are you so persistent in what some would describe as banging your head against the wall in trying to end this dual class structure when you know that Mark Zuckerberg won't go for it?
Well, I think you've seen that Facebook has gotten itself into a lot of trouble over the last couple of years. We actually have owned as much as 50,000 shares of Facebook over the time since the company went public. You know, I think that this is an opportunity for shareholders to weigh in and for citizens to think about what privacy means, what kinds of internet access we really want, what sort of information we think we're sharing. This is an opportunity for us to kind of weigh in on the ethics around data gathering and data dissemination. And so I felt for the last several years that when we look at companies like Facebook, like Google, where you have the primary founders of the company having these gigantic super voting majority shares, and we start seeing them having all kinds of problems in realms of their business that they never even imagined they would probably have problems in. We really have to look at corporate governance and oversight and think about, you know, is he really equipped to have all of the control at this point?
So, Julie, just to play devil's advocate here, I mean, some would sort of look at Facebook's earnings statements recently, and they would actually make the argument the company's still doing well. Top line growth is still growing. They're still adding users. So despite some of the ethical issues that could certainly are legitimate and could be raised, they're still making money for investors. The stock price is still up. Why should they change?
Well, they should change because some of their policies are getting them into a lot of hot water, and they ought to have some sort of perspective on what it is that they're doing. You know, I was thinking about the kind of trouble they got in with the Cambridge Analytica scandal. We've got another major election coming up in 2020. You know, these guys have got to have some sort of a perspective on what their responsibility is in terms of creating. If they're going to be a news station, which clearly they think they are, then they should be held up to some of the same standards that the rest of the media is held up to.
Julie, I wonder if you've gotten any responses from any of the other big shareholders. I know that Mark Zuckerberg, with his voting control, ultimately would decide whether this is something to be voted on. But have you talked to anyone from, say, Capital Group or T. Rowe Price or any of the more passive investors like Vanguard or BlackRock? What's been their response?
Well, you know, it's funny because we don't actually spend a whole lot of time talking to other shareholders. We file our resolution and we make our case. When Facebook or any of the other companies that we file with challenge us, we try to make our case again with the Securities and Exchange Commission. What's interesting about our shareholder resolution is last year, the Class A shares, which are the shares where it's, you know, sort of one vote per share, we received 83% of the vote. So those Class A shares represent the people that you're talking about. So they represent, you know, the BlackRocks and, you know, all of the other major mutual fund companies.
All right, Julie, I want to read we do have a recent statement from Facebook regarding some of their safety issues. They're basically saying that our recent efforts to improve the safety and security of our community have required significant investment, which has impacted our profitability. This level of investment may not have been possible if our board of directors and CEO were focused on short-term successes over the long-term interests of our community and our company. There's a bigger issue here, Julie, I think, about these dual-class share structures and this idea that they're sort of put in place because of sort of the long-term vision of the founders, of these people who are sort of have sort of these long-term stakes, and that sort of is a buffer against some of the short-term interests of investors. How do you respond to that? And do you actually think it's possible for companies that come to market with these dual-class share structures to actually sort of change and move to something that's a little bit more equitable?
I think it would be more equitable if everybody had one vote per share. You know, what I've said in the past is that people like Mark Zuckerberg and other founders, if they really wanted to maintain control of the company, they would have hung on to 51% of the shares of the company. I mean, that just kind of makes sense. I don't see any reason why, you know, this business about corporations being, you know, stressed out about quarterly earnings. You know, that's something that's been an issue for years and years and years. It doesn't mean that it's right. It doesn't mean that companies should be worried about quarterly earnings, you know, and not worried about sort of growth over a long period of time. That is absolutely not a reason why there should be a majority vote for Class B shareholders at Facebook.
Julie, you have another proposal as well, which is to separate the chairman and CEO role. Is there any chance the board members of Facebook, the other board members that is, might support that proposal?
It wouldn't matter if they did because, as we know, Zuckerberg is both the CEO and the chairman. I mean, a lot of these things, the calls to break up Facebook and all this other stuff, none of that can happen without the support of Mark Zuckerberg. He has complete control. He is immune from any sort of outside ideas about what should happen with the company. I mean, he even when he pulled on Nick Clegg, who is the guy who made the comments about his terrible concern about quarterly earnings reports. This is a guy who hasn't really been a great PR person himself. I don't know why he pulled somebody in from outside of the United States to take on a problem which was in essence really a huge problem in the U.S. and certainly will grow to be a bigger problem internationally.
So, Julie, looking back at all the issues Facebook has had over the last year or so, if these corporate governance changes had been in place already, do you think they would have avoided or at least mitigated some of those issues?
Absolutely. I mean, they try to throw, it was interesting, I was reading today that they're trying to throw Susan Desmond-Hellmann under the bus, one of the few female board members. This is what they try to do. They tried to throw Sheryl Sandberg under the bus. And I'm not saying these people don't have some sort of responsibility, but again, they are puppets. They're puppets in the hand of Mark Zuckerberg, the way the company is set up. And it really is going to be a problem. It may not, other people have said to me, oh, you should just divest your shares. Well, I actually sold, all the shares for my clients. It's only the shares in our pension account that we're hanging on to now because we are so concerned about the risk to shareholder value. And it may not be this year, but look, if this guy had a clue about how to operate a multinational global company, I mean, there's so many people that he could have had on his board advising him. He could have pulled in all sorts of folks to help him maneuver the legal challenges that he's facing, the government regulations, his growing business model. He hasn't really used anybody, obviously, who has been helpful to him in this regard.